So they said, "Your son chose war over family." So I watched him leave alone, but the town gave him a standing ovation. I never thought I'd be the father who'd watch his son walk away in uniform while his own family turned their backs on him. But there I was, standing in my driveway on that cold February morning in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, watching Jake adjust his army dress blues one last time before heading to the bus station. The bitter wind cut through my jacket, but it wasn't as cold as the silence that had filled our house for the past 3 weeks. Not since Jake announced he was deploying to Afghanistan. Not since my wife Sarah packed her bags and went to stay with her sister, saying she couldn't watch her baby boy become a killer. Not since my brother called Jake a warmonger at Sunday dinner, causing the biggest family fight we'd ever had. "Dad, you don't have to come with me," Jake said, his voice steady, but his eyes showing the hurt he'd been carrying. At 22, he looked so much older than when he first enlisted. The boy who used to climb onto my shoulders to reach the cookie jar was now a man who could carry a 100-pound pack across desert terrain. "I'm coming," I said, grabbing my keys. The words felt heavy in the morning air. Behind us, the house sat empty and quiet. Sarah had made it clear she wouldn't be there to say goodbye. She'd said her piece. He's choosing strangers in a foreign country over his own family. Her words still echoed in my mind. The 20-minute drive to the Greyhound station was filled with the kind of silence that says everything. Jake stared out the window at the familiar streets of our hometown, probably wondering if he'd ever see them the same way again. I kept glancing at him, trying to memorize his profile, the determined set of his jaw that reminded me so much of his grandfather. "I know Mom's upset," Jake finally said, as we pulled into the station parking lot. "I know Uncle Dave thinks I'm crazy for volunteering for this deployment, but Dad, I joined the Army to serve. These guys over there, they're counting on replacements, on reinforcements. How can I sit in a comfortable base in Georgia when I know they need help?" I parked the truck and turned to look at my son, really look at him. "Jake, I want you to know something. I may not understand war, and I may be scared as hell about you going over there, but I understand duty. Your grandfather understood it when he went to Vietnam, and I'm proud of you for following your conscience, even when it's hard." His eyes filled with tears. He wouldn't let fall. "Thanks, Dad. That means everything." We sat there for a moment, watching other families say their goodbyes. Some were crying, some were laughing through their tears, some were taking last-minute photos, but most had whole families there. Mothers, fathers, siblings, grandparents. Jake had just me. "Ready?" I asked. He nodded, grabbed his duffel bag from the back seat, and we walked toward the station together. Neither of us knew that half the town was already waiting inside. The moment we stepped through the glass doors of the Cedar Rapids Greyhound station, I realized something was different. The usual scattered travelers and empty seats were replaced by a crowd of familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store stood near the ticket counter, holding a small American flag. Coach Martinez from Jake's high school football team was there with several of his former teammates. Mr. Peterson, who ran the hardware store where Jake had worked summers during college, stood with his wife near the departure board. Jake stopped so suddenly I nearly bumped into him. "What's going on?" he whispered. Before I could answer, Mrs. Henderson approached us. She was a woman in her 70s who'd lived in Cedar Rapids her entire life, knew everyone's business, and wasn't shy about sharing her opinions. "Jake Thompson," she said, her voice carrying across the station, "I want you to know that some of us remember what service looks like." Coach Martinez stepped forward next. "Jake, I've been coaching for 30 years, and I've seen a lot of young men make important decisions, but I've never been prouder of one of my players than I am of you right now." His voice cracked slightly. "You're doing what you believe is right, even when it's difficult. That's the mark of a true leader." I watched my son's face transform from confusion to something I couldn't quite name. Was it relief? Validation? He'd been carrying the weight of family disappointment for weeks, and suddenly, here were people from his community telling him they understood. "How did you all know?" Jake asked. Mr. Peterson stepped forward, removing his worn baseball cap. "Son, in a town this size, word travels fast. When we heard your family was divided about your deployment, some of us felt it was important to show you that not everyone thinks you're making the wrong choice." He paused, looking around at the gathered crowd. "My father served in World War II. He used to tell me that the hardest part wasn't facing the enemy overseas. It was leaving home when the people you love most didn't understand why you had to go." More people began approaching. Mrs. Kowalski from the diner brought a care package filled with homemade cookies and beef jerky. The librarian, Miss Chen, handed Jake a small book of poetry, saying, "These helped my nephew when he was deployed to Iraq." Even some of Jake's former classmates had shown up, people I hadn't seen since high school graduation. The weight of the moment hit me as I watched my son interact with these people. Each conversation was brief but meaningful. Each person had made the effort to get up early on a cold Tuesday morning, drive to the bus station, and show support for a young man whose own family had essentially abandoned him on his departure day. "Attention passengers," the announcement crackled over the intercom. "The 9:15 a.m. service to Chicago, with continuing service to various destinations, will begin boarding in 10 minutes. Jake's expression grew serious again. This was it. The time for goodbyes and well wishes was ending, and the reality of his deployment was beginning. But something had changed in those past 20 minutes. The shoulders that had been carrying the burden of family disapproval now stood straighter. The eyes that had been filled with hurt now showed determination and gratitude. "I don't know what to say," Jake said to the crowd, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. "What happened next would stay with me for the rest of my life." "You don't need to say anything, son," came a voice from the back of the crowd. I turned to see Walter Hughes making his way forward, his Korean War veteran's cap on his head and his walking cane tapping against the tile floor. At 86, Walter was one of the most respected men in Cedar Rapids. He'd served 2 tours in Korea, came home, built a successful construction business, and raised 5 children. When Walter Hughes spoke, people listened. "Jake," Walter said, his weathered hands gripping his cane, "I want to tell you something I learned a long time ago. When you put on that uniform, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every person who believes that freedom is worth protecting, even when the cost is high, even when it means leaving behind people who don't understand." The station had grown completely quiet. Even the usual background noise of buses and announcements seemed to fade away. "Your grandfather and I served together in Korea," Walter continued, his eyes meeting Jake's directly. "Tom Thompson was one of the finest men I ever knew. He used to say that the hardest battles a soldier fights aren't always on foreign soil. Sometimes they're right here at home when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right." Jake's voice was barely above a whisper when he responded, "I just want to make a difference, Mr. Hughes. I want to help bring other soldiers home safely." "That's exactly what Tom would have said," Walter replied, and I saw Jake's eyes fill with tears again. "Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become, and I know I speak for everyone here when I say we're proud of you too." The boarding announcement came again, more urgent this time. Jake looked around at all the faces surrounding him, then at me. "Dad, I know, son. You need to go." Jake hugged me then, harder than he had since he was a little boy afraid of thunderstorms. "Tell Mom I love her even if she can't understand. Tell Uncle Dave and the rest of the family that I'm doing this because I love them, not despite loving them." "I will," I promised, though I wasn't sure they'd listen. Jake picked up his duffel bag and started walking toward the boarding area. I expected the crowd to begin dispersing, people heading back to their cars and their Tuesday morning routines. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Walter Hughes, despite his age and the difficulty it clearly caused him, stood up straighter and slowly raised his right hand in a salute. One by one, the other veterans in the crowd followed suit. Then Coach Martinez stepped forward and began clapping. Mrs. Henderson joined in. Within seconds, the entire station was filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't polite, scattered clapping. It was thunderous, sustained, heartfelt applause that seemed to shake the building itself. Jake stopped at the door to the bus and turned around, his face a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and overwhelming emotion. "Thank you," he mouthed to the crowd, though his words were lost in the sound of their appreciation. The applause continued as Jake boarded the bus. It continued as he found a window seat and waved to us. It continued as the bus pulled away from the station, carrying my son toward his deployment, toward uncertainty, toward a war that his own family couldn't support him in fighting. But as I stood there, surrounded by my neighbors and community members, I realized that Jake wasn't leaving alone after all. He was carrying with him the support and respect of people who understood that sometimes love means letting someone do what they believe is right, even when it scares you, even when it breaks your heart. The bus disappeared around the corner, heading toward the interstate that would take Jake to Chicago, then to his final training before deployment. The applause gradually faded, but people weren't rushing to leave. Instead, they gathered around me, offering words of comfort and support that I hadn't expected. "You raised a good man, Tom," Mrs. Henderson said, using my first name for what might have been the first time in 20 years. "That kind of character doesn't come from nowhere." Walter Hughes approached me, his cane tapping slowly across the floor. "I know this is hard," he said quietly. "When I left for Korea, my own mother wouldn't speak to me for weeks beforehand. She thought the war was pointless, that I was throwing my life away. But you know what? When I came home, she was the first person at the train station to welcome me back. Sometimes families need time to understand what they couldn't see before." His words offered hope, but I couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face when she'd packed her suitcase 3 weeks ago. The anger in her eyes, the way she'd said, "I won't be part of this. I won't pretend to support something that might get my son killed." I couldn't imagine her standing at any station to welcome Jake home. As the crowd began to thin out, people heading to work or back to their daily routines, Coach Martinez pulled me aside. "Tom, I want you to know something. What happened here today? This wasn't planned by any organization or committee. Word just spread through town yesterday evening that Jake was leaving this morning and that his family wasn't supporting his decision. People made their own choice to come here." "I don't understand," I said. "People in this town remember your dad, Tom. They remember what kind of man he was, how he served in Vietnam and came home and never complained, never asked for special treatment. They see that same character in Jake, and they see it in you too, showing up here alone to support your son when the rest of your family couldn't." I felt the weight of the morning finally hitting me, the loneliness of the past 3 weeks, the arguments with Sarah, the tension at family gatherings, the way Jake had tried to hide his hurt when no one except me seemed to understand his decision. But standing in that bus station, surrounded by the lingering warmth of community support, I also felt something else. Pride. Pride in my son for following his conscience despite the cost. Pride in my community for recognizing courage when they saw it. And maybe, for the first time in weeks, pride in myself for standing by Jake when it would have been easier to try to talk him out of going. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jake. "Dad, I can't stop thinking about what just happened at the station. I never expected anything like that. I'm scared about what's ahead, but I'm not scared of going alone anymore. Thank you for being there. I love you." I typed back, "I love you too, son. Stay safe and remember, you're carrying the support of everyone who was there today. You're never truly alone." As I walked back to my truck, I made a decision. I was going home to call Sarah. I was going to tell her about the applause, about Walter's words, about the way our entire community had come together to support her son. I was going to tell her that being afraid for Jake didn't mean we couldn't also be proud of him. I didn't know if it would change anything. I didn't know if she'd come home or if our family would heal from this division. But I knew that Jake deserved to deploy knowing that his hometown believed in him, that his father supported him, and that sometimes doing the right thing is worth doing even when it's the hardest thing you've ever done. The morning sun broke through the February clouds as I drove home, and for the first time in weeks I felt hopeful, not just for Jake's safe return, but for the possibility that love could find a way to bridge even the deepest disagreements. That morning at the bus station had shown me something important. Courage is contagious, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and applaud to remind everyone else what honor looks like.